Having waited 3 years since our last Arctic adventure, we were very excited to be on that overnight train from Stockholm. As the train pulled out from the station, the landscape started to open up, the beginning of 13 hours of fir, birch and pine trees, lakes and red wooden houses flashing past us. It was so good to be back on track. We got off at Mörjek. We were planning to walk the Padjelantaleden from Kvikkjokk to Ritsem, a lesser travelled route than our previous treks along the Kungsleden. The trip was planned pre-COVID, and I was acutely aware that I was now 3 years older and had only just had COVID 2 weeks before travelling. But we really wanted to do this, and we were up for the challenge. The first day involved a boat trip from Kvikkjokk with the legendary Björn the boatman. It was a wet and misty day as the boat set off, and Björn dropped us off at the beginning of the Padjelantaleden. I can't tell you how excited I was to find ripe cloudberries on that first day of walking. These berries have magical properties and give you extra special resources of energy. We walked 14 kilometres and set up camp somewhere before the Nungestugan. We pitched our tent in the pouring rain by a big river. Day 2 was a hard day. We walked 11 kilometres between the Tarakaisa-stugan and towards Sommarlappa-stugan, in rain and along marshy terrain, the path often becoming a stream. Swatting a mosquito off whilst walking on a wet and slippery boardwalk is not a good combination. This is how I ended up falling. I slipped right over onto my back. Luckily no injuries apart from a stiff knee for a couple of days. David said I looked like an upside-down turtle, but he dignified me with not taking a photo as evidence of the event. We could see the mountains in the distance and both longed to be there. Our favourite part of these treks are undoubtedly being in the Fjell, the mountainous areas without trees and with sweeping and panoramic views. But we had a few days to wait until we could enjoy that pleasure. Mosquitoes were swarming around us all day, and whatever bit of skin they find, they pounce. Both of my eyes were swollen from bites. It's not a good look, I have to be honest. And at the end of the day we did a bite count, but stopped at 100. We set up camp by the river, washed in a freezing cold pool in the river, then ate supper sheltering inside the tent due to the torrential rain and strong wind. In the morning, David devised the extreme weather technique for decamping, which consists of removing the inner tent, drying the ground sheet and the roof, and then us doing everything from inside, like breakfast, coffee and packing. This kept us dry at least until we started walking. When the clouds are low and the weather all around you is raging and stormy, wet and torrential, the best you can do is knuckle down and use any resilience you have and the tools that you have to cope. At these points you can't really look very much beyond the here and the now, or how to even do the next step. Then when the clouds lift, you can see beyond your own situation. You can see the mountains around you, the horizon, detail you couldn't see before. Suddenly the world feels very different. On day 3, we woke up to hear a storm outside. Very windy, torrential rain, tent being buffeted about. As soon as I was out of the tent, my hands were freezing and out came my woolly hat. We walked 15 kilometres, starting with wading across the river in knee-deep, freezing and fast-flowing water. It is quite scary and I had been quite anxious about doing this, but I'm pleased to say we both crossed successfully, although my feet were totally numb for quite some time afterwards. The theme of the day was wet boots, as we both started the day with boots already wet from yesterday's trudging through streams and marshy undergrowth. That day we were very excited to enter the Padjelanta National Park. It took us 3 full days to get there. And with this emerged open fjell, which made our hearts sing. We both slept very well that night, although it was freezing cold to start with, so we really had to snuggle together, and I put on an extra layer of merino. The theme of day 4 was the road goes ever on, and indeed it did, for we walked 26 kilometres, stopping at the bottom of a valley to collect 6 litres of extra water for the night, as we could not spot a river, then climbing to the top of the open fell. The weather was improving. We woke up to see blue sky for the first time. We felt pleased to at last remove our raincoats. Standing in the morning, eating my knusper muesli and drinking my black coffee, the sun shining, I heard a song in my head. Today's going to be a good day. The words of the day were energy and stamina. There was plenty more fording on this journey, which is when we cross a shallow stream keeping our boots on, as compared with wading, which is deeper and requires boots to come off, in our case, although some just walk on through, letting their boots and socks get drenched. We walked through the last of the trees beyond the tree line and up through Darelupal, where we stopped to pick up a few things. Another man called Björn sold us a delicious reindeer sausage made in Jokkmokk. It lasted us for 3 whole days. We had lunch there and straight afterwards climbed a steep and another exhausting climb before reaching the snow line. This day was hard and I was completely exhausted after the climb, but I knew I had miles to go before I sleep. We had another boots-off wade over 2 quite large, but thankfully not fast-moving or deep, stretches of water, although the water was freezing cold, around 6 degrees centigrade, and it took a long time for my numb feet to warm up after the wading. All I could think about was roll-on camping place and a nice hot meal. By that, read a bag of dehydrated food with boiling water poured in, sealed, and left for 10 minutes, but oh so good. On the subject of food, we usually had porridge with nuts and raisins in for breakfast, and snacks consisted of reindeer sausage, nuts, raisins, small amounts of chocolate. Lunch was 2 to 4 pieces of crispy rye bread with squeezy cheese on. Supper was a bag of dehydrated food. We dined well: chicken curry, bolognese, pasta carbonara, and beef hot pot. I can't tell you how much we appreciated every mouthful of our food. I'm sitting here. It's an absolutely glorious morning, fresh and bright. It's about 7 o'clock a.m. I'm just watching a herd of reindeer as they make their way across the fjell. There must be about 30 of them perhaps. They started off all together, but they're now sort of scattering a bit. So I'm wondering if they congregate for night time and then during the day scatter and enjoy life and meet again in the evening. A few moments later, we were just packing and getting ready to leave when I looked up and saw the whole herd grazing as they were also approaching. They gradually got closer and closer until they were maybe 20 or 30 metres away, at which point I looked a bit more closely and saw half a dozen males and 1 or 2 with very large antlers. It was a beautiful sight, but I confess that I was quite relieved when they changed directions and started moving away from us. We walked for about 20 kilometres that day, a long day's walk. As we passed through Stallerluokta, we stocked up on 3 days' worth of food from the famous Parfask kiosk. I carry the food, which means I took on a fair amount of extra weight in my pack. Wow, did it feel heavy, my rucksack now weighing around 20 kilos. We had lunch by the lake, followed by yet another post-lunch steep climb. after which I totally burnt out and snatched a much-needed sleep on the mountainside. I also managed to enjoy the wonderful views. But the next few hours of walking were very tough. First we climbed the mountain on the other side, then we came down, now we're climbing back up again. In fact, before that one we've been up and down several. Whew. Our pitch in Aras Lochta that night was far from ideal. I have never seen so many mozzies. They were absolutely swarming around us, biting through t-shirts and everything. There were a few mountain cabins available to hire from a Sami lady, and we noticed some of them were empty, so we cheekily sneaked into an empty one for half an hour to have a mozzie-free, candle-lit supper. Another bonus of this night is that we found a bathroom. We stripped off, braved the mozzies and freezing cold water, and had a much appreciated river bath. The next morning, after packing up, we paid for the pitch and had a chat with the Aras Lochta Stugverd, a Sami woman with a beautiful reindeer herding dog, a collie kelpie, plus a third breed we can't remember. It was imported from New Zealand and had been specially developed not to bark. He took a liking to David. We walked 17.5 kilometres, crossing the roaring Ladajokka River on a long bridge. On the other side we met a cabin warden who was just on her way to have a bath in the river. She pointed out the old Padilanta route to Gizuris, Gamla Leden, which was 16 kilometres as compared to the new route, 22 kilometres. Whilst the old route would be harder and a more traditional path, no boardwalks, less travelled, more marshy, less well signed, but with upright pointed stones, it appealed to us. So we opted for this one, which turned out to go over the mountain rather than around it, a detail we might have missed when taking the decision. This 2-kilometre climb up the mountain was very strenuous, but beautiful, and en route I had a bathe in the irresistibly tempting and cooling river that flowed nearby. Once at the top and on the flat, we started to look for a pitch for the night. We went off track by 100 metres or so. There we found a most lovely stream. This is our source of water for tea and food and washing and coffee. It's such stillness, and it's as fresh as anything. Crystal clear, absolutely crystal clear. And I was delighted to find 6 small reindeer antlers. My good omen that this was our spot. I later lined them all up and decided which ones to take. It was the whitest one. Every bit of the antler was still intact. It wasn't the biggest, but it was beautifully formed. An interesting fact about the reindeer, they are the only deer species where the females also have antlers. I like that. And that night we camped in our most remote spot to date, totally isolated and silent. I woke up at 2:15 a.m. and outside the tent it was absolutely beautiful, daylight really, with a little bit of orange in the sky. Before setting off on day 7, David got all the maps out to see how far we had got and take a good look at the remaining journey. We continued along the old route and walked 17 kilometres, starting with a 6-kilometre walk straight uphill, a constant and steep climb. By now the weather was very hot and still, no breeze to cool us. A tough start to our day. Despite the heat, I was ever scanning the landscape for reindeer antlers. I was thrilled to spot 2 large intact ones a little distance from the path. My dilemma was that I could only manage to carry one of them and would also need to part with a beautifully formed smaller set I'd found the day before. I made my selection and proceeded to carry one large set for the rest of our walk. On returning home, I weighed the set and I found that there were 1.1 kilos. No wonder my pack felt heavy.
Antlers. They can't stay here, they've got to come home.
We found our pitch on the top of a hill above the swamp. The pitch was excellent and we had a fresh stream nearby. It was wind-free and safe to light a fire. Day 8 was our last walking day of Padjelantaaleden. We covered 21.4 kilometres, of which approximately 8 was on the boat to Ritsum, where this part of our adventure ended. We walked on long, but thankfully dry, boardwalks through the swamp. David told me to walk carefully and not look at any lights in the water because we were in the dead marshes, for those who know this reference. As we walked towards Anonjalma, where the boat to Ritsum went from, we could hear the roar of the huge river and we approached Storbron, the big bridge where we were to cross. We were in awe of the force of water. The bridge stated clearly that only 2 people were allowed on at any one time. And the bridge sways, wobbles and moves when you walk. You are also aware that there is no falling in and surviving that river. Finally, we arrived at the boat jetty, and exhausted, I instantly fell asleep outside the simple cafe, closed when we arrived but opened shortly afterwards. The cafe is run without electricity or running water, and we chatted with the Sami reindeer's herder's wife and thoroughly enjoyed her freshly made, still warm Sami flatbread, with cheese and marmalade and a cup of tea. Bliss. A few hours later, we were on the boat to Ritsum, where we were thrilled to be able to celebrate the successful completion of our journey. We booked into a simple room in the mountain station, bunk beds and mosquito net in the window. We shared a tin of Norrlands Guld beer, used the shared kitchen to cook a pizza bought in the mountain station shop. I had seen people with supermarket bags from ICA, the Swedish equivalent of the co-op. I asked at reception where the local shop was, and they said the closest one was 160 kilometres, which is 100 miles away. So we decided we wouldn't go and get fresh vegetables after all. We felt relieved and elated that we had made it. That was physically the hardest thing I have ever done. Now, you may think this is the end of the story, but there's a bit more to tell. While this was the end of the challenge we set out to complete, the journey continued. So on day 9 we had a choice. Either spend 4 hours on a coach, followed by 24-hour wait for a train, then a train journey up to Abisko, giving us 2 days to then wait for our train back south. Alternatively, we could take a 28-minute helicopter ride, get dropped off at Alisjaure, and continue walking for 2 more days. We agreed that we were here to walk, so although we were still totally exhausted, we opted for the latter. The expertly piloted by Frida helicopter journey took us along the Kungsleden route, which we had walked in 2017. It was beautiful and moving to see the countryside open up below us. Frida showed us the location of an Arctic fox lair and how she takes local people to feed the foxes dog food. Due to climate change, there is an influx of red foxes moving further and further north, able to survive the warmer winters. Sadly, these are squeezing out the Arctic foxes. Later that day, we pitched our tent. We found a beautiful but exposed pitch high up, which we called Pride Rock. It overlooked the valley, lake and waterfall whose gentle roar we could hear in the distance. Because it was so exposed, David fetched boulders to secure the tent. It was a very cold night and thermals were needed. I was so tired that I ate our chocolate wafer, Kexchoklad, treat after supper in my sleeping bag and chewed it lying down. And for the first evening, I couldn't find the energy to go out and brush my teeth. In the morning, we took in the views and took our time to enjoy our morning coffee. I found some animal droppings which we later confirmed were fox, and we wondered if it was a red or an Arctic fox. On closer examination of the droppings, I could see a tiny beak and some bones of the bird that didn't get away. We walked 16 kilometres and found our final pitch by the river. When we were chatting, David spotted 4 or 5 long black creatures on the riverbank opposite us. We later confirmed that these were nothing more exciting than mink. It was with mixed emotions that we walked into Abisko on day 11. The end of this second leg of our trek indicated a definite finish to our Arctic Adventure 2022. Now, we like celebrating, so we did so again with an ensuite room, non-bunk bed, a hot shower, a change into clean clothes. Our bag had been sent by Nord Post from Kvikkjokk. A beer and a glass of wine and a wonderfully delicious meal in the mountain station followed. And the next day we boarded the overnight train to travel south again, already planning our adventure for 2023.